Hello everyone. Last week I had done a tip of the week on pivot points. And after I put up that tip of the week on pivot points, I had some sort of questions in response to some things that I think I had not addressed in that video. So I wanted to take the opportunity this week to talk to you a little bit more about pivot points before I move on to another topic next week. Let's talk a little bit now about pivot points again. I'll just recap what I said last week, that when you're working in Animate, then you have the option of doing a peg level pivot using your rotate tool, or setting your pivots directly on your drawing layer with your pivot tool. But you don't have the option that you have in Animate Pro and Harmony, where you can take the pivot from a drawing layer and promote it up to the peg level. So let's just do a really quick recap over here of that. So I've got this sample file of the Karate Rabbit here. I went back to the unrigged one for the purpose of showing just a couple of things today. So let's take, for example, the hand. I'll just take this hand right here. And you can do it in the camera view or in the drawing view. I think sometimes that it's safer to set your pivot points in the drawing view, because this isolates the drawing on its own, so you know that you've got the right drawing. So I'll just take my pivot point away from where it was there and smack it back over here. So when it's in the right spot, when I click on my transform tool, now my transform tool, when that drawing layer is selected, takes that pivot into consideration. And then if I add a peg layer that's a parent of this hand, it doesn't take that drawing into consideration by default. And so this is that case where when you're working in Animate, you can either just use the peg level pivots, which is kind of what I would recommend, because I think that's the easiest way there. And then you can split the different views onto different timelines, so I can just drag my peg layer pivot over there. Or you can use the trick that Shabana shows in the tutorial videos about using an empty drawing layer to set your pivot points. So let's talk a little bit more now about a couple of things regarding pivot points. Let's say that you are working in Animate Pro or Harmony, and you're wanting to do this option where you promote your pivot up to the parent layer. So I'll add my peg back again in here, and now I would like to go into my drawing layer. If I double click on it, and let me grab my layer properties from my other window there. Okay, so I would like to go into this drawing layer and then use the drawing tab and promote or apply the embedded pivot to the parent peg. So I can do this through my layer properties window. There's nothing wrong with doing it that way. But the only downside of doing it this way is that I then have to go into every drawing layer one by one and do that. And if you did want to do it in the layer properties window, then you can add your layer properties window as a window directly in your interface, and then I would copy it onto the side here, or drag it onto the side so that you can see it at the same time, and then as you go you can do it for each one. So let me just undo that addition of the peg that I did, and then I'm going to select all of my drawing layers, and then I'll click on that add peg button, which is going to add a peg for each drawing layer. So just to show you as an example, now if I wanted to take this eyelid one and promote it, I'd just go into my drawing and click there to apply to the parent peg, and then I just simply go down to the next drawing layer, click here, and apply to the parent peg. That's one way of doing it. But even when you do it that way, it still takes a little bit of time. So I want to show you another trick for Animate Pro and Harmony on how to do this a little bit faster. So I'll go into my network view, and I've got all of my drawing layers on one side, and I've got all my pegs sort of on the other side. So this is going to make it really easy for me to select all my drawing layers at the same time, since my pegs are all over there, because I can just drag all of my drawings. And once I have all of my drawings selected, actually it looks like I missed a few, so I can hold down, I think it's Command, yeah, I can hold down Command or Control to add to my selection. So once I have my selection completed, then there's a handy script that exists in the scripting toolbar. And I'll do another tip and trick later on about the scripting and how to do scripting and what's in the scripting toolbar. But for now, I just want to point out one script that's going to be useful for us for this. And that script is this script right here, which is called TB Enabled Drawing Pivot. And it kind of looks like a bullseye. So this is one of those preset scripts that comes with Animate Pro and with Harmony, and it also comes on this scripting toolbar by default. So if you select all of your drawing layers, and remember that you're doing this on the drawing layer, not on the peg layer, if you select all of your drawing layers and then you click on that TB Enable Drawing Pivot, then it's going to adjust all of the layers at the same time to take that particular attribute into effect. So that means that you don't have to go one by one. You can just select them all at the same time and do that option. And now if I check, if I go back to my transform tool and I click just on the peg layers, you can see in my camera view that the peg has now been taken into the drawing level pivot into account when I'm using my transform tool. So that's one handy script to know, and is definitely very widely used out there. Okay, so that's about getting the pivot point from your drawing to your peg. But another question that I had in response to the pivots video was what to do when you want to copy a pivot from one drawing to another. So let's take, for example, my hands. Let's go back to that handy hand layer. And so I've got my hand here now, and I'll look in my drawing view again just so that I can see all of the hands in one spot. So let's say that I've got one pivot way over here, and then my other hands have the pivot in the good spot. Well, let me just have one hand that has it in the good spot. So I'll move the others all to weird places. Oops, I moved all of them to weird places. Let me move all but one to weird places. Okay, so I've got one of them here that's in the right spot, and then all of my other drawings are having their pivots in the wrong spot. So there are a couple of ways that you can copy pivot points from one drawing to another. If you're just copying one pivot from one drawing to a second drawing, I personally think an easiest way to do this is just with your pivot tool selected, make sure that you select the drawing that's the drawing that has the correct pivot point that you want. And then I like to just hit spacebar and click to get the focus in my drawing view or my camera view, and I hit the spacebar because it brings up the hand. So I know that if I click in this window, it's not going to lose my selection or change anything in that with whatever tool I have selected. You can also turn on that focus on mouse enter property that will follow your mouse around. I just prefer not to work that way. And then the last thing you could do to get the focus in here is you could also click in this gray space on the top of the window. Once your focus is in this window, you can simply do your Control-C or Command-C to copy, and then you can select the next drawing that you want to paste the pivot to, and then get the focus back in this window again, and then Control-V or Command-V to paste. And you'll notice now that that pivot snaps into the right spot. And then you can even use your shortcuts as you go to zip through from one drawing to another to make sure that you've got all the pivots. So those shortcuts for previous and next frame are the comma and the period. They'll go back and forth. So that's one way of doing it. I personally like that way because it seems very visual and interactive to me, but there are other ways. So let's do this again, but I'll move some of these pivots off to the wrong spot, and I'll show you the other way. Okay, so the other way of doing this, oops, it looks like I moved that one as well. Oh, because it's the same drawing. Okay, so the other way of doing this, now I've got my other pivots in the wrong spot, is I can select the cell down here, and I can do my Control-C for copy with, with the timeline itself selected, just Control-C for copy. And then I can select the other drawings that I'm interested in updating. And then I can right-click, and I can do a Paste Special. And when I do the Paste Special, if you go into Advanced, then you see that there's an option here that says Update Drawing Pivot. So if I select that option and click OK, you'll notice that also updates the pivot on my drawings. So in a way, that way is faster because let's say you had 20 drawings. You don't have to flip back and forth through the different drawings to paste the pivot. So both ways are equally good for different scenarios, and they're both equally valid. Okay, so that's about copying the pivot point from one drawing to another drawing. Now, the last thing I had a question on in response to the video was, what about this pivot point right here on my transform tool? What is this pivot point, and why can't I use this pivot point to set, the pivot? What this pivot point is, when you select a drawing layer or a peg layer or any kind of layer, if I go up the hierarchy and I don't have a hierarchy set up on this one yet, but if I were to go up the hierarchy to the other drawing layers, then what this pivot does is, by default, the transform tool will take into account the pivot that has already been set on that drawing or that peg. So that's, by default, its starting location. Now you'll notice though that you can mouse over this pivot and you can drag it around. When you drag it, you see that there's a ghost there that's still there that represents where the permanent pivot of that drawing is. So basically what this is trying to indicate to me is that if for some reason on this frame and this frame only, I would like to temporarily rotate around that pivot up there, I can. But if I deselect and select again, it's going to go back to this pivot because this is the location of the permanent pivot of that drawing layer. So then I guess the question is, when would this be useful? And I think that you want to be cautious about using that kind of temporary pivot manipulation when you're doing something like a cutout character, because you might think that you're rotating around that pivot, but all that you're doing when you're moving this temporary pivot is you're helping yourself visually to create the next position where this is going to exist. But this drawing layer internally, its pivot point is still defined by this area. So what it's going to try to do is calculate the transformations necessary to achieve this position, with this permanent pivot. So hopefully that wasn't too confusing, but the main end of the story is that when you're working with a cutout character, you usually don't want to use that temporary pivot to move things around. You want to set the permanent pivots, set them on your drawings and promote them up to the pegs, or set them directly on the pegs with your rotate tool, and use those pivots as your permanent pivots that you're going to be animating with. If you're working in a scenario where you're animating, like, I don't know, you're animating a cylindrical tube around or something, and you'd like to, on one frame, just define the place where it's going to go. So let's do an example of this, because I think this is a little bit confusing. So I'll just create a new scene, and it doesn't really matter what resolution my scene is. Let me not save that file. Okay, so let's just take a rectangle, nothing too exciting, and I will fill it in with a color. White. Okay, so I've got my rectangle here, and I'll set my pivot point to be at the bottom of this. So maybe most of the time I'm moving my rectangle around like this. But there might be one case or one scenario where I would like to sort of, rotate this around something. Like maybe this is a plane that is orbiting the Earth, and the Earth is like down here. So if I drag my pivot point down to where the center of the Earth is, it will help me to determine the next position of that element. But if I look back through that animation, you notice that the animation that it's doing is not exactly what I would have thought it would do from just rotating around that temporary pivot. And the reason for that is that the pivot internally is still here. So what it's doing is it's taking this as position A, and it's taking the second position as position B, and it's simply calculating the shortest distance between those 2 points. So really, if you want to, if you want to get halfway in between and like move it up, you can adjust it to do what you want it to do. Now it's fairly good. So hopefully that cleared up a little bit of the confusion on pivot points. If you're working with most 90% of the scenarios, you would want not to move your temporary pivot. And then hopefully now you also understand how to copy and paste pivots from one drawing to another. And if you're using Animate Pro or Harmony, then you know how to make use of this enable drawing pivot script to copy the pivots from your drawing layers up to your peg layers. So that's it, and stay tuned next week.